What if the life you built with discipline and control was undone by someone who didn't believe in either Christopher Langston had everything mapped out: the name, the empire, the legacy, no mess, no surprises, no heartbeats out of rhythm? Then Madison Quinn showed up barefoot, laughing, unapologetically alive like a storm wrapped in sunlight. She shattered his family's most prized heirloom, and then, slowly, shattered the walls around his heart. They shouldn't work. She's all impulse. He's all order. But something about her made him question everything. Was it just bad timing and chemistry, or was it fate? Can love rewrite the script of a man who's lived his whole life by the book? And can a woman who's always run from expectations finally stay? If you believe that sometimes the wrong person is exactly what your heart has been waiting for, like, share and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because this isn't a love story built on perfection. It's one born from the beautiful wreckage of being real. Now, let's begin. The moment the delicate porcelain struck the polished marble floor of the Kingsley Manor, a sound sharp as lightning fractured the air. An eerie stillness swept over the room, replacing laughter and clinking glasses with a collective inhale. It was the kind of silence that held its breath. Among the stunned guests, draped in diamonds and designer suits, stood Christopher Langston, 42 years old, his posture stiff as stone. The celebration in full bloom had been to honor his younger brother's upcoming wedding, but now, Christopher could only stare at the chaos blooming at his feet. On the ground, a woman drenched in embarrassment, yet oddly unbothered, was hurriedly gathering the shattered remains of a Chinese heirloom that had graced the Langston family dining room for over 3 generations. His late mother's most treasured possession, now reduced to glittering debris beneath crystal chandeliers. "I think I broke something valuable," she said with an airy, almost inappropriate brightness, her southern lilt curling around the words. "Maybe it's still fixable." "Do y'all keep glue around here?" Christopher didn't respond. He was too busy observing the absurd scene: strands of fiery red hair slipping from a once elegant hairstyle and an emerald dress sliding just a touch too far up her legs as she kneeled. "Miss," he finally spoke, voice low but sharp enough to slice tension. "Please stand up. You're making it worse." She looked up at him then, and for a moment, he forgot the mess. Her face was flushed, her eye makeup imperfect. Her lipstick kissed out of place, but her presence held something unruly and beautiful. It twisted something deep in his chest that had long been dormant. "Well, someone skipped charm school," she said, standing and extending a hand coated in what looked suspiciously like chocolate mousse. "I'm Madison Quinn, but everyone calls me Maddie. Except my therapist, she likes to keep things formal." Her smile was playful, like she was in on a secret the rest of the world missed. Christopher didn't take her hand. He barely even looked at it. "Christopher Langston," he said with restrained formality. "I run Langston International, and I'm the older brother of the groom." Her eyes lit up. "Oh, that Christopher, the one Claire's always warning us about," she said, leaning in just a little. "I'm her sister, the one everyone hopes won't show up." She laughed, unapologetic. Everything about her was the opposite of Claire. His brother's fiancée, graceful, composed, deliberate. Madison felt like wind blowing through a window you didn't realize was open. "I should inform the staff," Christopher said stiffly, stepping back. But before he could turn away, her voice caught him carefree but disarmingly sincere. "You know, you carry yourself like someone who's forgotten what joy feels like, against better judgment." He turned back. "And you think you figured me out in, what, 2 minutes?" Madison moved closer, her eyes bright with amusement. "I didn't need 2. 1 was enough." Then she leaned in slightly, her perfume soft and citrusy, like sunlight through an open window. but don't worry. I specialize in waking up people like you." And with that, she walked off, leaving Christopher Langston, a man who controlled billion-dollar deals without blinking, completely and utterly speechless. Across the room, the groom watched it all unfold with a slow-building grin. Across the room, Jackson caught Christopher's eye and mouthed a silent sorry before disappearing into the crowd. Christopher adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, let out a controlled breath, and headed toward the bar. He needed something stronger than patience, perhaps a double bourbon or a miracle. What he certainly did not need was the memory of Madison Quinn's green eyes, bright and wild, still playing tricks with his heartbeat. There were nearly 3 full months until the wedding, 90 days of navigating this chaos in heels. Christopher Langston did not have time for this circus. As the head of Langston Global, a multinational tech conglomerate recently valued at over $80 billion, Christopher's life was scheduled down to the minute. 15-minute blocks dictated his day-morning briefings, quarterly reviews, late-night calls with investors in Dubai. A massive merger with a firm in Zurich was hanging by a thread, and the board was already grumbling about his aggressive pivot towards sustainable energy. And yet, here he was, sitting in a bakery that looked like it had been decorated by a sugar-high child with unlimited access to glitter glue. Soft pastels coated every surface. The air smelled of buttercream and vanilla. Across from him, Madison was enthusiastically devouring a tiny plate of cake samples, like a woman who hadn't eaten in days. Holy moly. She sighed, closing her eyes in theatrical ecstasy as she chewed. This one tastes like joy and sin had a baby. Christopher blinked. "Excuse me." She pointed to a slice topped with sugared flowers, champagne and elderflower. "I might propose to this cake." The elderly couple seated nearby exchanged scandalized glances. Christopher cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Miss Quinn." "Must we traumatize the elderly?" Madison licked frosting from her fingertip, slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. "Must you suck the fun out of every room you enter?" "Mr. Langston." It had been exactly 2 weeks since she'd shattered the family heirloom. 2 weeks since fate and Jackson's emergency business trip to Tokyo had inexplicably assigned him as her wedding planning companion. Emma, ever the diplomat, had pleaded with him to escort her sister, and somehow he had agreed. "Remind me again," he muttered, glancing at his watch, "why these meetings couldn't be moved." "Because, Ebenezer," she replied sweetly. "Top-tier vendors in Charleston are booked a year and a half in advance. Emma and Jackson were lucky to get these slots. Now hush and try this." She pushed another plate toward him. Lavender honey with edible gold leaf. It's practically poetry. Against every instinct in his body, he accepted the offered forkful. The cake melted on his tongue, subtle, elegant, balanced. He gave nothing away, but Madison's triumphant grin told him she saw through his stoic mask. "I knew it," she teased. "Mr. I only eat protein and profit margins actually likes whimsy." To his own surprise, the corner of Christopher's mouth betrayed him with a reluctant twitch. "Let's not get carried away." The bakery owner, a cheerful woman with flour on her apron and kindness in her eyes, approached them with a notepad. "Well, my dears, have we decided we'll go with lavender honey for the main cake?" Madison said confidently, "and champagne elderflower for the groom's cake. Also, could you still do that sugar sculpture of the Charleston skyline we discussed? Emma will cry happy tears." Christopher's eyes widened. "Perhaps we should review the cost before committing." "Oh, don't be so dramatic." Madison cut in, waving him off. "You've got more money than God. Let your baby brother have a wedding people will talk about for years." He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Somehow, with frosting on her cheek and sunlight in her smile, she made extravagance feel Right. The moment they stepped out of the sugar-scented bakery, the crisp autumn breeze wrapped around them like a silk scarf. The golden hour sunlight draped the streets of Charleston in a warm, honeyed glow. Madison glanced at her phone, thumbing through the schedule her sister had crafted down to the minute. "Next up, flowers on Middleton Street," she said, squinting at the screen. "Then we do the final dress fitting. Don't worry," she added with a grin. "I brought a blindfold for that part. No need for your fragile sensibilities to suffer." "I have a call at 3, Christopher said, already pulling out his phone to summon the car. "Investors from Berlin." "Cancel it," Madison replied, her fingers curling gently around his wrist. The contact was brief but electric, unexpected, uninvited, and undeniable. This is your brother's wedding, not just another item on your to-do list. Maybe show up for it like it matters. Christopher hesitated, torn between his well-worn armor of efficiency and the strange pull this woman seemed to exert without even trying. Madison Quinn didn't orbit his world. She disrupted it. The women he typically encountered in business or at high-profile events wore ambition like perfume, but she seemed immune to the performance. "Fine," he said at last, resigned. "But we're taking my car." "Oh, naturally." She rolled her eyes. Heaven forbid Mr. Langston steps foot on public transportation like a mere mortal. The black Bentley waited at the curb, a sleek, silent statement of wealth and control. Inside the leather-lined silence, Christopher stole a glance at her. Today, she wore worn jeans, real ones, not the overpriced kind, an old band shirt with faded letters, and a cardigan that looked more like a memory than a purchase. Her copper hair was pulled up into a loose knot, strands dancing freely around her cheekbones. She caught him looking. "You want a picture? It'll last longer." He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "I'm just trying to figure you out." "There's your first mistake," she said gently, her tone shifting. "I'm not some algorithm or quarterly report. I'm just me, Chris, complicated, messy, and not interested in being decoded." For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Christopher Langston found himself interested in someone not because of what they could bring to the table, but simply because they were real, and it unsettled him more than any hostile boardroom vote. Later that evening, the Langston estate loomed before them, sprawled across a dozen acres of ocean-kissed land. The main house, a graceful fusion of colonial charm and contemporary design, stood proud against the Atlantic, its windows catching the soft blush of sunset. Christopher checked his watch again. 6:25. Family dinner would begin promptly at 7, and punctuality in the Langston household was treated as law. Inside, the long mahogany table had already been set, the silver polished, the candles lit. His mother, Margaret Langston, was a figure carved out of old Charleston society, poised, particular, and terrifyingly precise. These Friday night dinners had been her ritual for decades. A tradition started when he and Jackson were boys. But tonight was different. Tonight, it wouldn't just be business chatter and subtle digs at Christopher's continued bachelorhood. Tonight, Emma and her parents would join them, and so would Madison. "You're pacing," Jackson observed from the doorway of the study, looking far too relaxed in a linen shirt and loafers. "I'm not pacing," Christopher replied curtly, halting mid-step. "I'm preparing." Jackson chuckled and crossed to the bar, pouring 2 generous fingers of scotch into crystal tumblers. It's dinner with family, not a boardroom coup. Christopher accepted the glass, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. Madison Quinn was somewhere in this house, and whether he was ready or not, she had already changed the rules of engagement. With Madison involved, "I'm not convinced this isn't a merger negotiation in disguise," Christopher muttered, taking the glass from his brother's hand and swallowing half its contents in one swift motion. The past 3 weeks had been a test of patience, tolerance, and self-control he hadn't realized he possessed. From wine tastings to wardrobe consults to an impromptu karaoke night, she'd dragged him to where he had, to his eternal shame, actually enjoyed himself. Madison Quinn had unsettled his carefully ordered life. "You don't hate it," Jackson observed, watching him closely over the rim of his glass. "In fact, if I didn't know any better," but the doorbell cut off whatever accusation he was about to make. Moments later, the familiar melody of their mother's voice drifted in from the marble foyer, warm and welcoming as ever. The Monroes had arrived. Christopher straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and followed Jackson downstairs like a man heading into battle. Emma Monroe, refined and elegant, greeted him with a composed smile and a light kiss on the cheek. Her parents followed a stately man with the quiet confidence of a judge, and a graceful woman who still carried herself like she belonged on a stage. And then there was Madison. She wore a simple black dress, not flashy, but striking in the way it clung where it should and floated where it didn't. Her hair had been coaxed into soft waves, and a light touch of makeup let her freckles show through. The result was effortlessly arresting. "Chris," she beamed, bypassing his offered hand and wrapping him in a warm hug before he could react. "Your place is completely ridiculous. By the way, I counted 3 fountains just on the drive up. 3. He froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden closeness and the now familiar scent of citrus that followed her everywhere before gently stepping back. "Miss Quinn," he said formally, trying to compose himself. "Glad you could make it." "Oh, please," she whispered with a grin just for him. "You lost the right to call me Miss Quinn after you sang Bonnie Tyler into a mic last week. Off key." Before he could respond or recover, his mother appeared, dressed to perfection and assessing Madison like a rare artifact under museum lighting. "So this is the infamous Madison," Margaret Langston said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emma speaks of you often." "All true, I'm sure," Madison replied sweetly, "except for the part about the Plaza Hotel. That actually happened. In my defense, how was I to know the fountain wasn't a swimming pool?" For a split second, something flickered in Margaret's expression, amusement or alarm. It was hard to tell, but she quickly turned to lead them toward the dining room. The meal unfolded more smoothly than expected polite conversation, polished silverware, a few well-timed laughs. But everything shifted during dessert. When Margaret, with the precision of a social scalpel, turned to Madison, Emma mentioned, "You work in—" "What was it again?" "Dear, I illustrate children's books," Madison answered, her voice light but unwavering. "Silly pictures that, hopefully, make kids fall in love with stories." "How creative," Margaret replied, in the exact tone one might use to describe finger painting on a refrigerator door. "And do you manage to support yourself with that?" Christopher opened his mouth, surprised at himself, but Madison gently touched his arm, silencing him with the smallest glance. "It's all right," she said calmly. "Yes, Mrs. Langston, I do quite well. My latest book won the Caldecott Medal, and I've worked with several major publishing houses. I also donate a portion of my earnings to the Children's Hospital where I volunteer on weekends." The room quieted. Even the clink of forks stopped. Christopher felt it, the subtle shift in perception. Eyes recalibrated, assumptions adjusted. And for the first time all evening, Christopher let himself really look at her. Not as the chaos-wrapped hurricane that upended his schedule, but as something far more dangerous, someone who made him feel. "She's always marched to her own rhythm," Robert said fondly. "But Madison's heart has always pointed true north." The conversation around the table shifted, but Christopher found himself quietly studying her. Something in the way she sat poised, yet never pretending. There was depth there, beneath the wit and whirlwind. He had misjudged her, completely. Later that evening, with the dinner winding down and the guests enjoying coffee in the sitting room, Christopher stepped out onto the terrace for air. He wasn't surprised to find Madison there, leaning on the railing, her gaze fixed on the silver-lit ocean. "You never mentioned any of that," he said softly, joining her. She didn't look away. "You never asked," she replied, her tone calm, but laced with truth. Too busy reading the cover to wonder what was inside the book. The honesty hit like a stone to the ribs, and he deserved it. "I'm sorry," he said, without defensiveness. She turned to him, eyes wide with surprise. "Did Christopher Langston just apologize? Do I need to check the sky for flying pigs?" He chuckled. This time not the guarded laugh reserved for boardrooms, but something real. "I can admit when I'm wrong. Once every leap year," she teased, but her smile was gentle. They stood in quiet for a moment, the sound of waves brushing against the rocks below. "There's a charity event next weekend," he said suddenly. "It's a gala for the Charleston Museum's education initiative. Would you come with me?" The question hung between them, a soft, vulnerable offering, like a date, she asked, studying his face, like, "I'd really enjoy your company," he answered honestly. Madison's smile unfolded slowly, lighting something inside him. "In that case, Mr. Langston," she said, extending her hand with mock formality, "I'd be honored." He took her hand. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a truth settled quietly somewhere between spilled wine, cake tastings, and unexpected laughter. Madison Quinn had begun to matter far more than he was ready to admit. The Charleston Museum, draped in soft gold lighting, had been transformed for the gala. Inside, patrons sipped champagne beneath oil paintings and marble sculptures, the hum of polite conversation echoing through vaulted halls. Gowns shimmered, tuxedos glinted, and Christopher Langston stood near the entrance, glancing at his watch for the third time. Madison was 15 minutes late, which, he reminded himself, was actually quite punctual by her standards. Still, a sliver of worry crept in until he looked up and saw her. Time stuttered. She descended the museum's marble steps in an emerald dress that clung to her like ivy, flowing and effortless. Her copper hair was swept up, not tight or overdone, but soft, almost romantic. She wore only small diamond earrings, simple, vintage, and later she would tell him, a gift from her grandmother. And when their eyes met, she smiled, and something inside him unraveled. "Sorry I'm late," she said, reaching him slightly breathless. "My cab driver decided to take the scenic route and tell me all about his conspiracy theories involving crop circles and Bitcoin." "You could have called," he said, then winced. He sounded more like a fussy uncle than a date, and Miss Jorge's full analysis of the Federal Reserve never. She grinned, slipping her arm through his. Despite himself, Christopher smiled. "You look—" He paused. "You look beautiful, Madison." Her eyes widened slightly, and for the first time that evening, she seemed unsure. A soft pink touched her cheeks. "You clean up all right yourself, Mr. Langston?" As they walked into the glittering room, Christopher was keenly aware of the eyes that followed them, the curiosity, the whispers. He didn't care. For once, he wasn't calculating impressions or reputations. He was just a man walking beside a woman who'd turned his entire world slightly off its axis and made it better for it. Charleston's most unapproachable bachelor, known more for his boardroom victories than ballroom appearances, arriving arm in arm with the wild-hearted sister of his future sister-in-law. The gossip columns would feast for weeks. Strangely, Christopher didn't care. "Mr. Langston," came a familiar voice. We're honored to have you this evening. Dr. Miriam Hollis, director of the Charleston Museum, extended her hand warmly. The pleasure's mine, Christopher replied, shaking it firmly. May I introduce Madison Quinn? She's a Caldecott-winning illustrator of children's books. He surprised himself with the pride that slipped into his voice. Dr. Hollis's eyes lit up. Miss Quinn, your work is remarkable. That watercolor series for Moonlight Tales, it brought such quiet magic to our storytime program. Madison's eyes sparkled. Thank you. That project was close to my heart. We're creating a new children's wing, the director added. We'd be thrilled if you'd consider consulting with us. As they fell into conversation, Christopher stood beside Madison, watching her come alive, animated, thoughtful, her gestures full of energy as she spoke about the power of art in shaping young minds. He found himself mesmerized. This woman, who had once barreled into his life like a late summer storm, was now revealing something deeper. Perhaps it had always been there. He just hadn't looked close enough. Dinner gave way to dancing. Soft jazz filled the air as chandeliers glimmered above. When he took Madison's hand and led her to the floor, she moved with ease and quiet rhythm. Years of ballet. She murmured as he twirled her. Mom's idea of grace training. I quit at 16 to join a modern troupe. Nearly gave her a stroke. Christopher smiled. I'm starting to think there are more layers to you than I can count. Madison raised an eyebrow. Whereas Christopher Langston is exactly what he seems, a perfectly tailored machine who thinks in charts and speaks in percentages. He let out a breath of amusement. Is that truly how you see me? She looked at him then, all laughter gone, her gaze steady and soft. No, she said, not anymore. For a brief, weightless moment, the world around them seemed to still just long enough for possibility to bloom in the space between their hearts. Then, thunder cracked across the sky. The museum windows rattled as wind howled against the glass. Rain began to fall. Sheets of it, loud and insistent. Ladies and gentlemen, an event coordinator announced. A severe storm warning has been issued. Please begin arranging for transportation home. The crowd began to scatter in murmurs and motion, silk gowns and polished shoes disappearing into the sound of rain. I should get you home, Christopher said, letting her go reluctantly. Outside, the storm had transformed the city into a painting light smeared by raindrops. Reflections puddled on cobblestone. They dashed to the waiting Bentley, both soaked by the time they slammed the doors shut. Madison's laughter rang out, rich and unfiltered. Water clung to her lashes like diamonds, her dress pressed to her skin, her cheeks flushed. Christopher couldn't help but stare. Where to, Miss Quinn? He asked, voice low as the engine purred to life. She paused. Then, with quiet certainty, said, Your place is closer. Right. Their eyes locked in the dim interior of the car. Rain tapped against the roof like a heartbeat. The space between them pulsed with something electric, something fragile and new. I'm drenched, and this storm's only getting worse. She didn't need to say more. The driver turned left at the next intersection, and the city disappeared behind them. The space between them thrummed, not just with the storm shaking Charleston's skyline, but with something quieter, more dangerous, unspoken, unpredictable. As you wish, Christopher murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. As rain painted the city in streaks of silver and glass, he felt himself stepping into unfamiliar terrain, one where no amount of planning, logic, or boardroom precision could help. And for the first time in his meticulously ordered life, he didn't want a map. His penthouse crowned the top 2 floors of a sleek tower just beyond the waterfront. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the storm like a living painting. Lightning cracked above the harbor, throwing harsh light across the room's pristine surfaces. Madison wandered in slowly, trailing her fingers along the cool leather of a minimalist couch. "It's exactly what I imagined," she said, her tone teasing, modern, expensive, and completely terrified of personality. He raised an eyebrow and tossed her a white towel. "I prefer the word curated." "Of course you do," she laughed, dabbing her hair. "Let me guess you paid a ridiculous amount of money to some fancy designer to make it look like you don't actually live here. I'll have you know, this place was featured in Architectural Digest last spring," he replied, a little more defensively than he meant to. "Oh well," she said, her grin returning. "If the magazine approves. Who am I to question your taste in sterile perfection?" She moved toward the windows, her damp gown catching the light, clinging to her figure in a way that made Christopher's breath hitch slightly. He cleared his throat. "You should change. Let me find something dry." 10 minutes later. She emerged from the guest bathroom in one of his old college t-shirts and a pair of sweatpants rolled up several times at the waist. Her hair was now pulled into a lazy topknot, her face bare of makeup. She looked breathtaking. Much better. She sighed, curling her legs beneath her on the sofa. "Though I'm 90% sure these sweatpants cost more than my rent." Christopher, now in jeans and a soft button-down, handed her a glass of wine. "I think you're exaggerating." "Fine. Half my rent," she said, smiling as she accepted the glass. They sat like that for a while, quiet, content. The storm tapped against the windows like a lullaby in another language. Then Madison broke the silence. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "for someone who supposedly couldn't stand me at first, you've been unusually gracious tonight." Christopher sipped his wine with practiced calm. "I never hated you." "Oh, please." She scoffed. "You looked at me like I was a smudge on your imported Italian shoes." "Well," he countered, "you did destroy a priceless heirloom while making jokes about glue." "Details," she said, waving a hand. "The point is you've been different lately. Almost human. Maybe you're just seeing the real me," he said, his voice softer now. She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "And what if I like what I see?" The air between them tightened, charged with something fragile but fierce. Possibility, maybe, or risk, or both. But before either could say more, Christopher's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Jackson. I should answer." He stood, walking toward the hallway. Madison remained on the sofa, her fingers tightening around the wine glass, heart pounding for reasons she hadn't dared name until now. Madison sat in quiet reflection, her gaze drifting between the glass wall and the storm beyond. Lightning stitched across the sky, illuminating Charleston's harbor in fractured silver. She wasn't sure what was more overwhelming, nature's display or the swirl of feelings inside her. Just a few weeks ago, she had pegged Christopher Langston as exactly the kind of man she spent her life avoiding, cold, calculated, emotionally vacant. Yet here she was, curled up on his sofa, wearing his clothes, her heart beating a little too fast for comfort. When he returned to the room, his expression had shifted. Serious, troubled. "Everything all right?" she asked. Sitting up slightly. "Not exactly," he said, dragging a hand through his hair. The carefully styled waves fell out of place, softening him in a way that caught her off guard. "Jackson and Emma. They've decided to postpone the wedding." Madison sat upright, the wine glass forgotten on the coffee table. Why? What happened?" "They've been clashing on some pretty big things," Christopher said, sinking onto the sofa beside her. "Emma wants to start a family right away. Jackson wants to wait until the Tokyo office is fully operational." They've decided to take a step back, reevaluate. Madison's breath caught in her chest. "Oh no," she murmured. "I should call her. Jackson said she's spending the weekend with your parents." She asked for space. Madison nodded, biting her lip. That sounded like Emma. When things got hard, she needed solitude to process, like a storm that gathered silently before it broke. Christopher was quiet for a moment, then said, almost to himself, "This complicates things." "You mean the wedding planning?" she asked. "No," he said, looking at her now, his eyes clear, direct, and intense. "I mean, this... us." Her heart thudded against her ribs. Is there an us? Christopher, instead of answering. He reached up and gently tucked a damp curl behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek and lingering just a second too long. Her breath hitched. "There shouldn't be," he said softly. "You're nothing like the women I usually date. You're unpredictable, spontaneous, always pulling me off script, half the time. I don't know what you'll say next." "Wow," she breathed, eyes wide, romantic, really laying it on thick. But he leaned in closer, his voice growing more vulnerable. "I can't stop thinking about you. The way you light up when you talk about stories. Your laugh. The way you see the world full of wonder. Like it still deserves saving." Madison swallowed hard, suddenly unable to speak. "If that's your version of a heartfelt confession," she whispered, "you may need professional help." He laughed, then a real one, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "I've been told emotional expression isn't exactly my strength." "Shocking," she said dryly, even as she leaned toward him, drawn by something both terrifying and inevitable. When their lips finally met, it was like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. The kiss started soft, uncertain, then deepened, the storm outside mirroring the one unfurling inside them. Her fingers found his hair, and for one suspended breath, the world slipped away. Thunder cracked overhead, breaking the spell. They pulled apart slowly, breathless, blinking. "Well," Madison said, trying to steady her voice. "That was unexpected," he offered, his composure still finding its footing. "I was going to say inevitable," she replied, a slow smile blooming on her face. He reached for her again, but she stopped him gently, placing her hand over his heart. "Christopher, we need to talk about Emma and Jackson. If they're struggling, this complicates everything." "You're right." He sighed, pulling back. Their situation changes things. The unspoken truth hovered between them if Emma and Jackson couldn't find their way back to each other. What did that mean for the two of them? One step at a time. Madison said quietly, "One problem at a time. And for now, that would have to be enough." "First," Madison said, her voice quiet in the darkened room, "we help our siblings figure things out." She hesitated, then words catching on something unspoken. Then Christopher prompted, his fingers finding hers and lacing them gently together. "Then," she whispered, "we figure us out, outside." The rain still fell, steady and cleansing. Inside. Their conversation wandered into the softest corners of vulnerability. They spoke not just of Jackson and Emma, but of childhood memories, old fears, hidden hopes. For the first time in his life, Christopher Langston dropped his guard and spoke aloud of the weight of legacy, of a father whose expectations had no ceiling, of a mother whose affection came only in carefully measured doses. And for the first time in her life, Madison Quinn felt seen not as the mess, the misfit, the one who never quite followed the script, but as someone worthy of being understood. By the time the first pale light of morning spilled across the Charleston skyline, the storm had passed, and so had something in them. Something had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. They hadn't meant for this to happen. But now that it had, the thought of losing it was unbearable. 1 month later, autumn had fully claimed Charleston. The leaves had turned to flame scarlet, gold, and rust, and the air carried a crispness that hinted at the winter ahead. Christopher sat on a wooden bench near the lake in Hampton Park, pulling at the collar of his sweater, though the breeze was gentle. He glanced at his watch again more out of habit than impatience. "You're fidgeting," Jackson said, appearing beside him with that maddening calm he always carried. "I'm not fidgeting," Christopher replied quickly, lowering his hands. "I'm thinking." Jackson gave him a knowing grin. "Thinking about how Madison Quinn somehow turned my emotionally constipated older brother into a man who buys novelty refrigerator magnets." Christopher gave him a sidelong glance. "I run a multinational firm. I am not domesticated," says the man who drove 6 hours to Raleigh just because she mentioned craving a specific bakery's blueberry muffins. Christopher said nothing. There was no defense. The last month had been a quiet revolution. Madison had become part of his days and his nights. His apartment now bore her fingerprints, a bright scarf flung over the back of a chair, sketchbooks left open mid-idea, a cactus in the kitchen she'd named Frank. More than her things, she had taken root in his routines, in his thoughts, in his guarded heart. "Have you talked to Emma?" he asked, shifting the topic. Jackson's expression softened. "Last night. We're meeting again this afternoon. To talk. Really talk." Ever since the wedding was put on hold, the Langston and Monroe siblings had found themselves forming an unlikely support system. Madison had quietly steadied her sister, offering reassurance without pressure. And Christopher, to his own surprise, had done the same for Jackson, listening without agenda. And Christopher pressed. Jackson drew in a breath. "And I'm going to tell her the truth, that I've been a fool, that I love her more than any company, any plan, any timeline. I want what she wants, whatever it looks like, as long as it's with her." Christopher clapped a hand on his brother's shoulder. "That's the right call." Jackson glanced sideways. "And what about you and Madison? Are you finally going to tell her how deep you're in?" Before Christopher could answer, his phone buzzed. A text lit up the screen from Madison. "Operation Lovebirds in motion. Emma en route to the garden. Prepare your brother for full emotional grovel." Christopher chuckled and stood, extending a hand to pull Jackson to his feet. "Well, that's your cue. She's waiting for you in the Japanese garden." Jackson straightened his jacket, suddenly looking nervous. "Does she even know I'll be there?" Madison told her. "It's just sister time," Christopher said, smiling. "Now go remind her why she fell for you in the first place." "You've got this," Christopher said, giving Jackson a light nudge down the winding garden path. "The rest is yours to figure out." As his brother disappeared among the arching oaks of Hampton Park's Japanese garden, Christopher glanced at his watch. Another habit that meant little when it came to her, then turned in the opposite direction. Madison had promised to meet him by the marble fountain near the lake. Once she'd delivered Emma to her fate, he found her exactly as he expected, perched on a weathered bench, legs tucked beneath her, sketchbook balanced in her lap. The wind caught strands of her copper hair, sending them flying around her face as she worked, entirely absorbed. He paused, just watching, still awed by how someone so unpredictable could bring such clarity to his life. "You know, spying is rude, even for men in custom suits," she said, not looking up. "I prefer the term observing strategically," he replied, walking over to press a kiss to her temple. She leaned into him, eyes still smiling as she closed her sketchbook. "Mission accomplished," Emma's en route to either embrace your brother or throw him into the koi pond. I left the outcome vague for dramatic effect. That's reassuring. Christopher chuckled. Jackson's bracing himself. He looks like a man walking into both a proposal and a trial. Madison tucked herself under his arm, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. They're meant to be, even when they forget it. A long breath of contentment passed between them as the late autumn breeze danced around them. Christopher laced his fingers through hers, brushing his thumb along her knuckles. Speaking of people who belong together, he began. Madison pulled back slightly. One brow arched. If you're about to compare us to our siblings, I may be forced to throw you into the koi pond. I was actually going to suggest something permanent. Her teasing faded as she saw the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet box. Madison's breath caught. Christopher, what are you doing? Something wildly uncharacteristic, he said, flipping open the box to reveal a vintage ring and emerald at its center, framed by two delicate diamonds, which feels right, considering that's what you've been to me from the start. Wild, unpredictable, exactly what I never knew I needed. We've only known each other 2 months, she whispered, staring at the ring as if it might vanish. And yet I've never been more certain of anything, he said, taking her hand gently. Madison Quinn, you upended everything I thought I wanted and gave me everything I didn't realize I was missing. Will you marry me? Tears shimmered in her eyes, catching the golden light. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely above a breath. I'm still the girl who cannonballed into your family dinner and broke your mother's favorite vase, and you're also the woman who reminded me that a life without joy, without surprise, isn't really a life at all, he said. You're the woman I love, every unfiltered, chaotic, beautiful bit of you. A brilliant grin broke across her face. Well, when you put it like that. Instead of answering, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him with such force that they nearly toppled off the bench. Christopher laughed into her mouth, holding her tightly. I'll take that as a yes, he said. Yes, she confirmed, eyes shining. Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and she admired it, still beaming. Your mother might actually faint when she hears about this, Madison said. She'll recover. Christopher replied with a smirk. She's grown rather fond of you since you redesigned the children's wing at her hospital foundation. Art-based bribery, Madison said, nodding seriously. Never fails, sitting together by the marble fountain, with leaves swirling gently around them. Christopher and Madison were already sketching the outlines of their future, his mind spinning in timelines and spreadsheets, hers darting in colorful bursts of what if and why not. Then Christopher's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and smiled. It's Jackson. He showed her the message. She said yes. Wedding back on. Best man duties resume. Madison grinned. Should we tell them our news? Christopher shook his head, pulling her close into his side. Let's give them today. We'll have a lifetime for our own announcements. She leaned into him, eyes twinkling. Christopher Langston preaching patience, who are you? And what have you done with my emotionally rigid billionaire? I've been completely undone, he murmured, brushing a kiss against her hair, by a certain chaotic redhead, and I wouldn't change a thing. As the soft autumn sun washed the park in amber light, Christopher looked around and marveled at how drastically his world had shifted. When Madison Quinn had barreled into his life with clumsy charm and ink-stained fingers, he'd thought she was a disruption. She turned out to be the rescue he never saw coming. 6 months later, a short column in Charleston's Post and Courier made quiet waves among the city's elite. In a rare double ceremony that has Charleston society abuzz, 2 Langston brothers were wed yesterday at the family estate overlooking the harbor. Jackson Langston, CFO of Langston Global, married longtime fiancée Emma Monroe, while his older brother, CEO Christopher Langston, surprised guests by tying the knot with Madison Quinn Emma's younger sister and a nationally acclaimed illustrator of children's literature. Guests spoke of the elder Langston, usually known for his impenetrable stoicism, smiling unabashedly as Madison approached the altar, barefoot, in an unconventional emerald green gown. Margaret Langston, the family matriarch, was reportedly overheard saying, "Well, I suppose if anyone could thaw that man's heart, it'd be a Quinn girl." The couples honeymooned separately, Jackson and Emma in Paris, while Christopher and Madison embarked on what she called a beautiful mess of an adventure, refusing to plan anything in advance, much to her new husband's cautious dismay. When asked about the future, Madison Langston simply replied, "We're writing our story one unpredictable page at a time." 1 year later, Emma and Jackson welcomed twins, a boy and a girl. Jackson opened the Tokyo office but arranged to work remotely half the year, spending every spare moment with his family. Emma, radiant and calm, found joy in both motherhood and mentoring young dancers at a local academy. Robert and Catherine Monroe settled into a sunlit cottage in the Vermont countryside, hosting noisy, joyful family weekends filled with toddlers, pies, and spirited debates. Even Margaret Langston, ever composed and immaculately dressed, surprised everyone by developing an unlikely closeness with her younger daughter-in-law. She even allowed Madison to redecorate parts of the estate in a manner I suppose is charming, she later admitted with the tiniest of smiles. As for Christopher and Madison, they built a life neither of them had imagined, but both deeply needed. Their Charleston penthouse was reborn, still structured and sophisticated in parts, but warmed by color, whimsy, and walls full of storybook sketches. It was a place where chaos and order didn't just coexist, they completed each other. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed a daughter named Sophia. She had her father's sharp gaze and her mother's free-spirited laugh. Christopher read bedtime stories in voices he'd once reserved for boardroom presentations, and Madison illustrated each chapter of Sophia's life with magic and mischief. And somehow, in the beautiful tension between structure and spontaneity, they built something that felt like home. Christopher Langston, once the picture of discipline and control, now spent his evenings reading storybooks in a dozen different voices, each character more ridiculous than the last, while his daughter squealed with delight. He never flinched when finger painting turned into a full-body experience, even if it meant another designer shirt met its colorful demise. In the quiet stillness of late nights, with Madison sketching beside him and Sophia dreaming in the next room, he sometimes found himself reflecting, what if she hadn't shattered that vase at Jackson's engagement party? What if he'd stayed guarded, distant, too proud to see the wonder in the woman who'd quite literally crashed into his world? He didn't dwell long. Instead, he would glance across the room at the woman curled up in his sweatshirt, humming absent-mindedly as she added a purple dragon to a page of her next book, and offer a silent thanks. To fate. To chaos. To the moment his world was turned upside down, only to discover it had finally, truly fallen into place. Sometimes, the love that changes everything doesn't arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it crashes into your life in the form of spilled wine, ruined heirlooms, and unexpected laughter. Christopher and Madison weren't meant to be. Not on paper. He was precision. She was chaos. But somewhere between mismatched plans and spontaneous kisses, they found a rhythm only their hearts could hear. Not a perfect story, but a true one. A reminder that healing can come in the form of someone who sees the beauty in your brokenness. That joy can exist even when life doesn't go according to plan. That the most extraordinary love stories often begin with an accident. If this story moved you, if it made you smile, pause, or see a little of yourself in these imperfect hearts, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to show your love. share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more moments that speak to the soul. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us what really matters.